Hey everyone, welcome back to another Karen story. Have you ever wondered what you'd do if someone kept trespassing on your private property and tried to sabotage everything you've worked for? Well, today's video dives into exactly that, a wild situation involving a determined Karen, a warehouse full of dreams, and one business owner who had to make a split-second decision. So here's the story. The person behind this account is a small business owner who built their company from the ground up. It wasn't an easy road. While they're now in a good place financially, able to support both themselves and their grandmother, it definitely hasn't always been smooth sailing. In fact, when they first started out, there was a lot of hate directed at them and their business, especially because of the community they lived in. Small towns can be tough, and unfortunately, judgment came fast and often. They couldn't just pack up and leave either. Things got so bad that their mom tried to kick them out. But their grandma stepped in, literally throwing their own daughter out the moment she issued an ultimatum. Even with that support, life wasn't simple. As their grandmother's health began to decline, they became her caretaker. But they never complained, not once, because their grandma had done so much for them over the years. Still, no matter how close they were, they couldn't convince her to leave the state she'd lived in all her life. So they stayed too. The business itself started modestly, building a following online, mostly through social media. Eventually, luck struck when one of their designs went viral. That one break gave them the confidence to quit their traditional job and go all in on the business. But as they'll tell you, one viral post doesn't mean instant success. It was just the push they needed to get into the real grind. Running the business while taking care of their grandma meant money and time were always tight. But they were beyond grateful for the chance to build something meaningful. Their grandma was right there with them every step of the way, cheering them on. She was actually the one who sparked their love for fashion in the first place. One of the first big moves they made was setting up a warehouse/workshop. They owned a little bit of swampy land, and that's where they built it. The house they grew up in, where their mom had lived, was barely bigger than a mobile home. At first, they used part of their own space for small handmade orders, but once the business really took off, they needed to expand. They built part of the warehouse as a workshop for custom, handcrafted items, and the rest for storing bulk-made products they could later personalize. It might sound like a lot of detail, but it shows just how important this business was. It was their main source of income, a passion passed down by their grandma, and a way to connect with a creative community they otherwise wouldn't have access to in their area. Of course, something this valuable needed protection. Every inch of the warehouse, inside and out, was covered by surveillance cameras. Their grandma thought it was overkill, but they weren't taking chances. Even though they hadn't experienced any serious violence, they knew people were capable of more than they expected. So, they even hired a security agency to watch the warehouse most nights. Now, the community they lived in wasn't super tech-savvy. A lot of people didn't even know they ran a business, let alone what kind. But then there was Karen. Not her real name, obviously. She was one of those moms in town who thrived on drama and hate, though she usually kept it to harsh comments or whispered insults. Everything changed when she found out about the business after snooping around her son's social media. From that point on, the negativity ramped up, especially among the other mothers in town. At first, they brushed it off. These women mainly fought online, and they figured there wasn't much physical danger involved. But they should have paid closer attention when things started going wrong with the security company. They'd already suspected they were being charged more than others in town, despite likely being lower risk. Then the company suddenly jacked up their rates to ridiculous levels. When they refused to pay, the company broke the contract a month early, leaving them completely without security overnight. Their grandma didn't mind. She never liked paying someone else to protect what was theirs. But the business owner let too many red flags slide. They figured the alarm system would hold up, and if anything happened, they'd handle it themselves. That's when they mentioned something important. Their grandfather had taught them how to shoot before he passed away. He believed every woman should know how to defend herself properly. They didn't love carrying a gun, but they were licensed and knew the basics. And that training would come in handy sooner than they expected. The very first night without the security team, the alarm went off. Later, they'd learn that Karen had orchestrated the whole thing. Her husband was friends with the owner of the security company, and she'd asked him to cut the service as a favor. But at the time, all they knew was that when they checked the camera feed, there was a woman with a gas canister walking into their warehouse with a key. They'd made sure the security company returned their keys when they quit, but apparently, they'd made copies. Luckily, whoever was behind it didn't think they'd change the alarm code after the company left. That mistake saved everything: the business, their livelihood, maybe even their lives. Heart-pounding, they grabbed their gun and headed toward the warehouse. The door Karen had opened swung wide, the alarm blaring. Inside the storage area, the overhead lights revealed a trail of gasoline soaked into the floor. They checked some clothes near the entrance and realized she'd drenched those too. Trying to keep calm, they called out, "Hello? Who's in here?" A voice replied, faint and muffled, coming from the direction of the workshop. Adrenaline surged through them. Panic was creeping in, but they hadn't drawn the gun yet. Their grandfather had drilled into them that a weapon should only be used if someone was threatening their life. Still, their hand hovered near the holster. As they moved deeper into the warehouse, they found Karen cornered in the workshop, the heart of their operation, where she'd poured gasoline on several unfinished projects. When they walked in, she turned toward them, holding up a lighter. They glanced at the exterior door and saw the deadbolt was still locked. If she lit that flame in a room full of gas fumes, it could kill them both. "You don't want to do that," they said, raising a hand, palm out, trying to de-escalate the situation. At the same time, they flicked the safety off their gun. "I don't want to either," Karen responded, "although things do get complicated if you're in here." She told them they were supposed to stay tucked in bed until the firefighters arrived, which didn't make much sense, but clearly, this wasn't a normal situation. They tried to keep things calm as they edged closer. Then Karen reached for a pair of scissors, holding them out in her free hand. "You get near me, and I won't need the lighter." So here's another story, and this one comes from the subreddit r/traumatized. I've been scrolling through it a bit more lately, and honestly, it's starting to grow on me. Some of the stories are just intense. Let me know in the comments if you've checked it out too. I'd love to hear your thoughts. This particular post is titled, "Want us to move our freshly buried family member from the family plot? Enjoy not being able to access your farm this spring and your ruined reputation." Now, that title definitely grabs your attention. Here's what happened. In May of 2024, the poster's wife, in her 40s, her sister Sarah, also in her 40s, and Sarah's fiancé, Heath, then in his 40s, got married. They had been together for 8 years, and during that time, Heath had become a full-time dad to Sarah's daughter, Kate, who was 16 at the time. Everyone agreed Kate truly deserved him. A few weeks after the wedding, Heath officially adopted Kate. He was the kind of guy everyone loved. Funny, genuine, hardworking, always the first to offer help and the last to leave a party because he stayed behind to clean up. He loved bringing people together, always looking for an excuse to fire up the grill, pour some bourbon, and make memories. The last time he did that was for his 50th birthday. A month later, almost to the day, he suffered a massive heart attack and passed away. The poster stood by Heath as a groomsman, just like their younger brother-in-law, in his 30s, and one of Heath's closest friends. And then, 6 months later, they were standing beside him again, this time as pallbearers at the same church. To say the family was devastated, and still is, would be an understatement. The poster describes their side of the family as close-knit. They don't really use the term in-laws. Their brothers-in-law are just brothers, and their wife's sisters are like their own. Even Jackie, their mother-in-law, and Mitch, the father-in-law, see them all as their sons. They genuinely enjoy spending time together, whether celebrating or mourning. But going through both with the same person and in such a short time was something no one was prepared for. It's something the poster says they wouldn't wish on anyone. Heath was meticulous about a lot of things, but oddly enough, there was one thing he never planned, where he wanted to be buried. A few weeks before he passed, he and Jackie had a conversation about final arrangements. At the time, no one knew anything was wrong. It was just casual talk. She mentioned wanting to be buried in the family plot, where her grandparents and parents were laid to rest. She said that when she and Mitch passed, there would be 2 or maybe 4 spaces left. Most of her cousins had already made other plans. Heath liked the idea of resting beside them, so when the time came, that's where he was buried, right next to Jackie's parents, in the family plot. Cut to November of 2024, Heath was gone, and life had suddenly become a blur of grief and decisions that needed to be made fast. There was space in the family plot, so the arrangements were made quickly. He passed away on a Saturday, and they laid him to rest the following Friday. By Monday, Jackie, their mother-in-law, received a phone call from one of her cousins, Bertha, who was in her 60s. But it wasn't a call to offer condolences. Instead, Bertha opened with, "How could you bury that stranger next to Grandma?" The conversation was mostly one-sided. Bertha went on and on about how wrong it was for this man, someone she clearly didn't consider part of the family, to be buried beside their grandmother. She even mentioned visiting the town hall to see what could be done about it. Jackie's only response was calm but firm. "Bertha, he was my son. We just buried him. We didn't know what else to do." Mitch, Jackie's husband, later told them he'd never seen her that angry in over 45 years of marriage. They decided not to tell Sarah right away. She was already dealing with the unbearable weight of grief, and adding this on top of it seemed cruel. A few days passed, and then Jackie got another call, this time from Charlotte, in her 70s, who was married to another cousin. Charlotte shared the news that Bertha and her sister had hired a lawyer and were planning to sue Sarah to have Heath's remains removed from the plot. That's when Mitch and Jackie knew they couldn't keep it quiet any longer. They went to Sarah and Kate's house to explain everything that had been happening. Sarah, understandably, was furious, confused, and deeply hurt. She owned the plot where Heath was buried, and the one next to it, so legally, she had every right to make that decision. But beyond the legal side of things, how could someone who claimed to be family do something like this? One of the last people to hear about all of this was my wife, not because they didn't want her to know, but because she has a certain reputation when it comes to defending the people she loves. She doesn't mess around. She believes in going full scorched earth when someone crosses the people closest to her. So, they wanted advice before bringing her into the situation. But there's some more context you need to understand what happened next. Before Jackie's grandparents passed away, they set aside a 12-plot space in the local cemetery to accommodate future generations, their kids, grandkids, and so on. It was pretty forward-thinking, especially since Jackie's mom was one of 5 daughters. As it turned out, only 5 of those 12 plots had been used at the time. Jackie's parents and one of her cousins were already buried there. Of the 5 sisters, only Jackie's mom had been laid to rest in the family plot. In addition to the cemetery space, each of the 5 sisters inherited a piece of farmland and built homes nearby. That's where Jackie, Bertha, and their generation grew up, close to each other. Some of them stayed in the area and built their own homes to raise their kids. Jackie and her brother eventually inherited some land from their mother, which they rented out for farming. Next to that is Bertha's property and her twin sisters, both of which are accessed by the same private path. And here's the key detail. The only road access to Bertha's land is state-owned, but the path leading to it, the actual driveway, is entirely owned by Jackie and her brother. Now, I won't go into every detail of my wife's reaction. Let's just say it was intense. But by the end of the conversation, she had a very clear idea of what needed to happen next. My wife's reaction to everything that had happened with Bertha and the family plot was, let's just say it wasn't subtle. She suggested that if Bertha and her side of the family really wanted control over where people were buried, they could move Heath, Jackie's parents, and basically start their own little cemetery somewhere else. Her exact words? They can effing choke on it. That was her solution, not out of spite exactly, but more like a fiery mix of frustration and standing firm. Mitch and Jackie thought about it, looked into the legal side of things, and realized something interesting. If they did move Heath and Jackie's parents, it would leave 3 empty plots in the original family space. Add Sarah's existing plot, and the 2 that Mitch and Jackie still owned, and that made 6 total, all controlled by their immediate family. Out of the original 12-plot space, only 3 would remain unused and not under their ownership. Another family member had already passed away and been buried there, so now only 2 plots were technically unclaimed, though those 6 open spots couldn't be used without access. To most people, that might seem like enough, but not to my wife. She's the kind of person who sees burning bridges as a form of self-expression. To her, this was just the appetizer. The main course was going to take years to play out, and honestly, she was already looking forward to it. In the meantime, they set aside a quiet section of their farmland to rebury Heath and Jackie's parents. It's peaceful there, surrounded by tall pines and wide open fields. There's plenty of room for others in the family who might want to rest there someday too. The only catch is that the current path leading to it is pretty long and inconvenient. But that's about to change. At my wife's suggestion, when planting season starts, Jackie and her brother plan to ask the renters who farm the land to disc over the old path and create a new one, much closer to the new burial site. And here's the kicker. That new path will cut off access to Bertha's property completely. As mentioned before, the only way onto her land is through that very same route, which is entirely owned by Jackie and her brother. We haven't told Bertha about any of this. And we don't plan to. Her entire frontage is blocked by trees anyway, so unless someone lets her know, she might not find out until the farming crew shows up to start preparing the fields for the season, which would definitely come as a surprise. Now, Bertha may act like a villain in this story, but in real life, she's actually a highly respected medical educator in the community. Most nurses in the county know her name, and she even taught my wife back when she was in nursing school. But here's the thing, my wife is also well-established and respected in her field. And she's made sure that word about Bertha's behavior spreads slowly, quietly, but surely. Like water wearing down stone, it takes time, but once it happens, you can't undo what people think of you. And with that, I'll move on to the next story, one that starts with family, sacrifice, and the kind of fight that doesn't happen in courtrooms alone. My parents are hardworking immigrants from Mexico, and they raised me with a deep sense of justice and an unshakable drive to succeed. They gave everything they had to make sure I had opportunities they never got. My mom juggled multiple jobs to save up for my college fund, while my dad worked punishing hours in construction just to keep a roof over our heads. Because of them, I ended up at Baylor Law School and eventually landed a job at a small personal injury firm in San Antonio. I threw myself into my work, driven by a passion for defending the rights of people who'd been taken advantage of, especially working-class Latinos, many of whom were undocumented and stuck in dangerous jobs with no real recourse when they got hurt. Across Texas, there are predatory employers, insurance companies, and even lawyers who exploit these communities. They know the language barriers and fear of deportation keep people silent. But I built a reputation as someone willing to stand up to powerful interests on behalf of the powerless. Late nights studying medical records, challenging corporate lawyers in court, negotiating settlements. That was my calling. But the long hours and distance from Dallas meant I didn't get home as often as I should have. Our phone calls were filled with family gossip and stories about my latest courtroom wins, but looking back, I missed some warning signs. The first red flag came when my dad was seriously injured at a construction site. A poorly built scaffold collapsed, sending him falling 2 stories. He was lucky he didn't end up paralyzed, but the compound fractures in his tibia and ankle ended his career. I immediately offered to handle his workers' comp case. I knew how much he'd need every penny for surgeries and rehab, but my proud, stubborn father refused. He said he already had a lawyer and didn't want to impose. No matter how much I pushed, he wouldn't budge, just kept giving me vague reassurances that my uncle would help deal with the language barrier. I dropped it, buried under my own workload, not knowing until much later that my uncle hadn't been involved at all. Weeks went by, and I was stunned to hear that my dad's case had settled for $380,000. Given the seriousness of his injuries, the lifelong pain management and physical therapy he'd need, it was a strong claim. For an undocumented worker, that kind of payout was almost unheard of. I was so relieved I cried at my desk, the weight of worry lifting instantly. I took time off and drove up to Dallas to celebrate with my family. We had a whirlwind weekend full of laughter, tears, and my mom's homemade tamales. Dad didn't want to talk about the case details, so I didn't push. Giddy with joy and maybe a little tequila-fueled, I thought it was strange that the lawyer didn't show up to celebrate, not even a handshake or a quick visit. I chalked it up to a busy schedule. But that blissful ignorance shattered a few months later when my uncle showed up at my door, grim-faced, and holding a thick manila folder. "We need to talk," he said, voice heavy with worry. "Your papa, he's in trouble." Stunned, I invited him in, my mind racing as he recounted a twisted tale of greed, manipulation, and outright fraud stretching back months. It turned out the lawyer my dad hired wasn't the savior he claimed to be. He was known in legal circles as a shark, aggressive, ambulance-chasing, with a roster of mostly Latino clients despite not speaking Spanish. Worse yet, my dad hadn't seen a single penny of the settlement. The money had supposedly been paid out, but somehow, my parents were still drowning in medical bills. Mom was juggling part-time gigs again, and Dad was taking whatever under-the-table construction jobs he could find, putting his recovery at risk. All the while, the lawyer kept telling them that if they stopped paying him, he'd report them to ICE and have them deported. He dangled the promise of the settlement over their heads, saying the funds were just tied up in red tape, and if they stayed quiet and kept paying, everything would work out. A little digging revealed the full extent of the lawyer's crimes. He'd used a network of shell companies to divert settlement money, paying out just enough to keep clients complacent. The threat of deportation was his go-to weapon, used repeatedly to silence complaints. On paper, his clients received their full settlements. In reality, they remained trapped in debt, bound by fear. I was horrified and consumed with guilt. How could I have missed this? How could I have left my parents vulnerable like that? I knew I had to make things right for my parents, but I also knew I couldn't afford to act recklessly. As much as I wanted to storm into that lawyer's office and confront him head-on, I understood that would have been a mistake. He was too slick, too well protected by layers of lies and people who helped cover his tracks. If I gave him any hint that we were onto him, he'd bury the evidence and likely retaliate against my family. So instead, I went straight to my law firm and told them everything, the whole messy, twisted story. To their credit, they didn't hesitate. They immediately offered their full support, and we quietly hired a top-tier team of private investigators to start building an ironclad case. For months, we followed the lawyer, documenting every move he made, from suspicious cash withdrawals out of client trust accounts to secret meetings in dark parking lots with known associates. We even caught him on camera threatening a sobbing client, trying to scare her into silence. The evidence was damning, but it wasn't enough yet. We needed the paper trail, the financial records that would prove just how deep his corruption ran. To help build that, I embedded myself in the Latino community, earning trust and gathering testimonies from others he'd hurt. The stories were heartbreaking. People who lost their homes, medical needs left unmet, years spent trapped in a cycle of debt and fear, all because of this man who wore a suit and called himself an advocate. Piece by painful piece, the puzzle came together. Shell companies, forged signatures, falsified documents, and a far-reaching scheme designed to exploit the most vulnerable for personal gain. When we finally took our case to the district attorney, it was a slam dunk. The lawyer and his network of accomplices were arrested in a dramatic sting operation that made headlines across the state. He faced charges of grand larceny, fraud, extortion, and more, crimes that carried the threat of decades behind bars. In the end, he decided to plead guilty, hoping for a lighter sentence. But the judge saw through it. Disgusted by the betrayal of the very people he swore to protect, the judge handed down a harsh sentence, several years in prison and a lifetime disbarment. It was a fitting end to a career built entirely on lies. For my family, it was a bittersweet victory. We got every penny back, but the damage had already been done. My dad's leg never healed properly during those months of uncertainty, and the years of stress and financial instability had taken a real toll. So I made the decision to move them down to San Antonio, where I could make sure they got the best possible care, physical therapy, counseling, specialists for whatever they needed. It was an adjustment for all of us, but we figured it out together. And before we wrap up this video, let me share one more quick story, this time from the subreddit r/pettyrevenge. The title? Revenge Served Cold. This isn't my own story, but one my late partner used to tell. He worked at a modern bar, great selection of IPAs, open to all ages, and even had a little toy box for kids whose parents brought them in. Inside that toy box? A kazoo. One afternoon, a pair of parents let their kid grab it, and that was the beginning of the end. The child did not stop blowing that kazoo. For hours. Non-stop. The parents sat at a table as far from the bar as possible, out on the terrace, and did absolutely nothing the entire time. The rest of the bar? Tortured. Well, the afternoon passed. Evening rolled in. And around 8 p.m., the parents suddenly remembered they had a kid. They picked her up, dropped the kazoo back into the toy box, and started heading to their car. That's when petty revenge struck. My partner grabbed the kazoo, caught up with them just before they reached the car, and handed it back to the kid with a big smile. Oh, she seemed to love it so much, she can keep it. The look on the parents' faces, too polite to say no, but clearly horrified, was worth every screechy minute of that noisy afternoon. Yeah, it wasn't my story, but I think it deserved to be shared. Alright, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again next time.